America has no shortage of haunted hotels. Most are impossible to separate from folklore, but very few are said to be haunted by the same person more than a century after their death. At the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, some guests claim they've encountered the spirit of the housekeeper of room 217. More than a century later, many believe she's still on duty. People have been staying at the Stanley Hotel for more than 100 years, and most leave with nothing more than photographs of the mountains. But every so often, someone checks out with a story they can't explain. Again and again, guests have reported hearing footsteps in empty hallways, seeing doors open on their own, or waking to find their belongings mysteriously moved while they slept. One room, however, appears in those stories more than any other, room 217. Many believe its strange reputation began in 1911, when the hotel's head housekeeper, Elizabeth Wilson, survived a devastating gas explosion while preparing the room during a power outage. Guests would later claim that luggage was mysteriously unpacked, clothes neatly folded, and that unmarried couples seemed especially unwelcome. One of those couples was Liam and Maya. They had come to Estes Park for what was supposed to be a quiet weekend away. After 3 years together, Liam hoped a change of scenery might help reconnect with Maya. Room 217 seemed like just another famous hotel room with a few ghost stories attached to it. By the end of their first night, neither of them cared whether those stories were true. They checked into room 217 on a Friday afternoon, expecting nothing more than a quiet weekend together. For the first few hours, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. At 3:14 in the morning on November 9th, the night desk at the Stanley Hotel took a call from room 217. The man on the line wasn't reporting a break-in. He wasn't reporting a fire. He was asking, in a voice the front desk clerk would later describe in her own incident notes as controlled panic, why his girlfriend's ankles had started to bruise in front of him, in real time, with no injury, no fall, nothing touching her, while she sat bolt upright in bed, stared at a blank wall, and spoke in a voice that was not hers. By the time hotel medical staff reached the room 7 minutes later, the marks were already fading. But 3 people in that room that night will tell you they saw them, and none of them have ever agreed to be interviewed about it since. If you know anything about the documented history of room 217, the fact that it was her ankles, specifically her ankles and nowhere else, is the detail that should make the hair on your arms stand up. To understand why, you need to see 2 documents. They were written 115 years apart, in the same room, and they explain almost everything that happened to a couple named Liam and Maya that weekend. The first document is a hotel incident report dated June 25, 1911. It describes a gas explosion that tore through the second floor of the Stanley Hotel just before 8 in the evening, loud enough that people in town heard it a mile away. The head housekeeper, a woman named Elizabeth Wilson, had been lighting the hotel's backup gas lamps during a storm-related power outage. Nobody knew gas had already leaked into the room for hours. When she struck the match, the floor detonated under her feet and dropped her straight down into the dining room below. Witnesses reported seeing a bathtub thrown into the air by the blast. The official injury record lists 2 shattered ankles. Not a broken hip, not a head wound, not burns, though the blast was severe enough to have caused any of those. Ankles. She survived. She went back to work less than 2 years later and ran that hotel's housekeeping staff for almost 4 more decades, enforcing the same standard of order she always had, bags unpacked, clothes folded, rooms accounted for, until she finally retired in 1950 at the age of 90. The second document is a reservation confirmation generated on a hotel booking system on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 115 years later. Under guest type, there are 2 checkboxes: married, not married. A man named Liam checked the wrong one. It took him 4 seconds. He didn't think about it again. Most reports stopped at folded clothes and neatly unpacked luggage, but for unmarried couples, there was something more unsettling. They described waking to a line of freezing air running down the center of the bed, as though an invisible boundary had been placed between them. Every one of those earlier reports stops there. A cold draft, some folded shirts, an unsettling night, a good story to tell at dinner parties, nothing anyone ever needed a doctor for. Nobody in that hotel's recorded history has ever described what happens when a guest doesn't just bend the rule Elizabeth Wilson enforces, but lies about it in writing, on paper, with her own name on the record above it. Liam and Maya checked in on a Friday. 3 years into a relationship that had gone quiet in the way relationships do, before either person says it out loud, he'd booked the weekend hoping the mountains would help. He didn't think about the checkbox again once they were unpacking. The first sign came fast. They went down to dinner at 7, bags zipped, door locked. When they came back an hour and a half later, both suitcases were open on the luggage racks, completely emptied, their clothes folded into color-coded stacks on opposite sides of the dresser, hers on the left, his on the right, not one item overlapping. The deadbolt hadn't been touched. Liam called the front desk. A supervisor came up, looked at the drawers without a flicker of surprise, and offered immediately, almost automatically, to move them to a different floor. Liam said no. He didn't want to repack. Maya didn't argue with him, but she kept glancing at the dresser for the rest of the night like she expected it to change again while she wasn't looking. There was a second thing that happened that evening, smaller, easy to explain away at the time. Around 9, while Liam was in the bathroom, Maya says she heard 2 soft knocks against the inside of the closet door, not from the hallway, not from the room next door, but from inside the closet itself, where their coats were hanging. She opened it. Nothing there but the coats and an empty luggage rack. She told Liam about it when he came out, and they both laughed about it. Decided the building was just old. Decided a 100-year-old hotel makes noises the way old houses do. Neither of them wrote it down anywhere. It's the kind of detail that only matters in hindsight, and it only came up again weeks later, when Liam sat down and tried to reconstruct the timeline of that night for himself, hour by hour, the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself something has a rational explanation, and keep failing to find one. At 11, they turned off the lights. At around midnight, Liam woke up cold. Not room temperature cold, one-sided cold, the kind that only made sense once he realized it was coming off Maya's half of the bed, specifically, like she'd left a window open on her side that didn't exist on his. He reached over to pull the comforter up over her shoulder and found the sheets on her side, genuinely cold to the touch, noticeably colder than his own, in a room where the thermostat hadn't moved all night. He didn't think much of it. Old building, he told himself, drafty windows, and he went back to sleep within a few minutes. He woke again a little before 1, and this time Maya wasn't beside him at all. She was standing at the foot of the bed, in the dark, facing the door, completely still, not swaying, not fidgeting, just standing, her arms at her sides, in a posture nobody holds naturally in their sleep. He said her name quietly, not wanting to startle her if she really was sleepwalking. She didn't answer, and she didn't turn around. After a few seconds that felt much longer than they were, she simply turned and climbed back into bed on her own, pulled the blanket up, and appeared to fall back asleep instantly. Liam lay there for a long time after that, watching her breathe, telling himself it was nothing. He'd remember later that this was the exact moment he stopped believing that. At 3, everything changed. Liam woke to his name, cut short, hissed right at the edge of his ear like it had been exhaled through clenched teeth. He sat up. The room was empty, and that's when he noticed Maya was already upright beside him, eyes open, staring at the wall at the foot of the bed, not moving. He said her name. Nothing. He put a hand on her shoulder and her whole body locked rigid under his palm, the way a limb does right before a cramp, except it didn't let go and didn't ease. Then she spoke, and the voice coming out of her wasn't hers. It was dry, strained, pulled through a throat that sounded like it had been breathing smoke, in a clipped, formal accent that belonged to no one in that room. "You lied," she said. "The register. Correct it." Liam didn't understand yet what she meant. He wouldn't. Not for a few more minutes. What he understood, in the moment, was that Maya's breathing had gone shallow and fast, that her hands resting on top of the sheets had curled into an angle no relaxed hand rests at, and that her feet, bare, hanging just off the edge of the mattress, had gone perfectly, unnaturally still, toes pointed down, ankles locked together like they'd been bound. He reached for her ankle without thinking. It was ice cold to the touch, colder than the room around it by a margin he could feel instantly, the way you feel a metal railing in winter before your brain has time to process why. That's when he saw it, a faint discoloration blooming across both ankles at once, symmetrical, spreading in real time the way a bruise spreads under skin that's just been struck. Except nothing had touched her. She didn't flinch. She didn't seem to feel any of it. He was the only one in that room who looked afraid, and he was the only one who would remember later that for about 4 seconds, her whole lower body had gone as rigid and unmoving as something set in a splint. That's when he called downstairs and said the word ankles into the phone, before he said anything else. The on-call medic reached the room within 7 minutes. By then, the marks on Maya's skin had faded to almost nothing, visible if you knew exactly where to look, gone if you didn't, and by the time he was crouched in front of her, checking her pulse and shining a pen light across her pupils, there was nothing left on her ankles for him to see. His incident report, filed later that morning, logs her breathing as rapid and shallow, her muscles tight through the calves and forearms, and notes it as hyperventilation with muscle spasming, most likely brought on by altitude and travel exhaustion. A write-up nearly identical word for word to a dozen other incident reports the hotel has on file for that same room, going back years. He asked Liam in passing if anything specific had happened to her legs. Liam said he wasn't sure. By then it was true. The marks were gone, and in the fog of 3 a.m. adrenaline, he genuinely couldn't say with certainty what he'd actually seen versus what he thought he'd seen. The medic didn't push. He had no reason to. He left basic aftercare instructions and went back downstairs, and it would be almost an hour before Liam, lying awake, replaying it, was certain enough of what he'd felt under his own hand to trust it again. Liam didn't go back to sleep. He sat up next to Maya in the dark, running that phrase over in his head, the register, corrected, until 4 words that had meant nothing an hour earlier suddenly meant everything. He thought about the checkbox. 4 seconds, no thought, forgotten before he'd hit submit. At 4:30 in the morning, while Maya was still slumped in an uneasy half-sleep beside him, Liam got up, got dressed, and went downstairs to the front desk himself. This is the detail most people miss when they hear this story secondhand. The paper register Liam asked for wasn't the hotel's legal booking system. That lives entirely online now, checkboxes and all, locked down the way any modern reservation system is. What he asked for was something else, a leather-bound guest logbook kept specifically for room 217, a tradition the hotel maintains for guests who request the famous room, letting them add their own note or signature alongside the decades of names before them, the same way some old inns keep a logbook by the door. It isn't official. It isn't legally binding. It's sentimental mostly, a keepsake for guests who want to say they were there. He asked the night clerk, the same one who'd taken the 3:14 call, to bring it out. She hesitated. Guests don't usually ask for it at 4:30 in the morning, and something about the look on his face made her ask if he was all right before she went to get it. He said he was fine. He wasn't, and they both seemed to know it. But she brought the book out anyway and set it on the counter between them. He found the entry he'd signed at check-in, room 217. His name. Underneath the standard line where guests can note who they're traveling with, he'd written Mr. and Mrs. without thinking, the same reflex that had made him check the wrong box online days earlier. He asked for a pen. The clerk told him, a little uncertainly, that guests don't usually go back and edit their own entries. But there wasn't a rule against it, not really, and something about how he asked made her slide one across the counter without further argument. He crossed out Mr. and Mrs. underneath it. In his own handwriting, he wrote, "Not married," correcting the record. He signed his name beneath it and dated it, the way you'd sign a confession, and slid the book back like he wanted it out of his hands as fast as possible. He went back upstairs. Maya was awake by then, sitting up on her own, looking at him like she'd surfaced from somewhere far away and wasn't sure yet how long she'd been under. She didn't remember any of it. Not the voice, not the wall, not her own ankles. When he asked her if anything hurt, she said no. When he checked in the gray early light coming through the curtains, there wasn't a mark left anywhere on her skin. It was as if the last 6 hours had happened to someone else entirely, and she'd only just been handed the body back. They didn't sleep again. At first light, they packed their bags, properly this time, nothing left folded by anyone but themselves, and checked out before the sun had cleared the peaks behind the hotel. Neither of them said much on the drive down. Here's the part of this story that most retellings leave out, because most people never bother to check. 6 weeks after that weekend, a friend of Liam's, who knew the story only in outline and thought it made a good excuse for a weekend trip of her own, booked room 217 for herself and her husband. Out of curiosity, and a little bit of morbid humor, she asked the front desk if she could see the same guest logbook Liam had described to her over drinks. It's a request the staff get often enough from history buffs and ghost tour regulars that nobody blinked. The clerk on duty pulled it out and set it on the counter without a second thought. The page was there, the date was there, Liam's name was there, in his own handwriting, crossed out and corrected exactly the way he remembered writing it, right down to the shake in the pen strokes from a man who'd been awake since 3 a.m. Underneath his correction, in the same column, in a hand that didn't match his, didn't match the clerk's, and didn't match anyone on staff according to hotel personnel records going back years, there was one more line, noted. Nobody at the hotel could explain the second entry when Liam's friend asked about it. It doesn't exist anywhere in the digital reservation system. It isn't in the clerk's handwriting or her supervisor's, or in the handwriting of anyone who has worked the front desk during the 6 weeks between the night Liam wrote in that register and the afternoon a stranger asked to see it. According to the hotel's own visitor logs, no other guest touched that book in the meantime either. It had simply sat there behind the desk, closed, the way it always does, with one line inside it that nobody has come forward to claim. Liam still doesn't have an explanation for any of it. Not the ankles, not the voice, not the sentence under his own handwriting that he never wrote. What he does know is that within a month of getting home, whatever quiet distance he'd booked that weekend to fix had turned into something neither he nor Maya could close. They didn't fight about the hotel. They barely spoke about it at all once they were back in the city. They just ended cleanly, the way some things do once whatever was holding them together quietly lets go. Maya has never said what she remembers from that night. Liam has never asked her, and somewhere in a leather-bound guest logbook behind a hotel front desk in Estes Park, Colorado, there is still a page with his name on it, corrected in his own hand, and one line underneath it that, as far as anyone has been able to prove, wrote itself. If you ever find yourself staying at the Stanley Hotel and someone offers you room 217, take it. Just make sure every name you write is true, because if the stories are right, Elizabeth Wilson still keeps track of who checks in. We'll be back next week. Same day, at 3 a.m. Sleep well. And if you ever wake in the middle of the night and the person beside you is sitting perfectly still, don't assume they're awake. Some people stare into the dark. Others are staring at someone you can't see.